This is Lesson 712, the Italian Renaissance, Petrarch, the Classics, Secularism, and Humanism. The place, Italy, about the 1300s to the 1600s. And here's a picture of Italy, and notice something about it. This is Renaissance Italy, and what you can notice is that Italy is not actually a country the way we think of Italy as today. Today, Italy is a republic, but back then, Italy was not a country. It was a hodgepodge of numerous what we call city-states, and we've definitely talked a lot about city-states, haven't we? Key concepts of the Italian Renaissance: secularism, scholasticism, the classics, humanism, and, of course, the word Renaissance. Key people of the Italian Renaissance. Well, there were many people involved in the Italian Renaissance, but we're going to look at just three: Petrarch, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and Cicero, who actually did not live during the Renaissance. He lived centuries before, but he had a big impact on the Renaissance. And we have a quote from Cicero: "We study history not to be clever in another time, but to be wise always." History is where we find universal, timeless solutions to our problems. They're not located anywhere else. So why Italy? Italy, as we know, was in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, just like the Romans were, whom we've already studied. In fact, the Romans turned out to be a big part of the Renaissance, even though they had lived centuries before. Italy had access to trade throughout Europe. We studied that. And there were many wealthy merchants in Italy. Italy was a center of commerce. And when we say commerce, we're talking about really three things to think of: industry, trade, and banking throughout Europe. It had always been more urban than the rest of Europe. Feudalism and manorialism, which we studied, hadn't put down roots as deep in Italy as they had in the rest of Europe. Industry and commerce were strong in Italy, particularly in the wool trade. And these things require lots of cash, which banks collect and then loan to ambitious people with big ideas. Italy was also a collection of independent city-states, and boy, have we studied those. Italy had lots of independent city-states that could experiment with different kinds of governments. We saw that with ancient Greece also. That's how they came up with democracy in Athens. And in the Italian city of Florence, the merchants of that city eventually kicked all the nobles out in the year 1293. The nobles weren't producing anything of value, and the merchants were doing all the work to make the city better. So the merchants decided, we are going to be a republic. The problem with that was this: how do you run a republic? What skills do you need? What rules do you follow? There hadn't been a republic since the ancient Roman Republic many centuries ago. But the answer was literally all around them. You see Roman ruins everywhere in Italy. The answer was with the ancients. But a better education would be necessary if people were going to learn how to run a republic. The medieval education system did not prepare you for the things you needed to be able to do to run a republic. The universities of Europe followed a course of study called Scholasticism. And Scholasticism was a very job-based, very narrow system. There were three main courses of study: law, medicine, or theology. You didn't go to the university to find yourself or to broaden your horizons or to pick a major. You went there to become a theologian or a doctor or a lawyer. Scholasticism was also a very logic-based kind of education rather than based on, let's say, observation or experimentation or hands-on learning. What you did was you started with a question about something you already believed in through faith, and then you used logic instead of evidence to prove why what you already believed was true. There was no room for changing your mind about a question or an issue based on any new information. For example, you might start off with the question, is it ever okay to tell a lie? And then what you did is you took all the sources that you have of all the great thinkers who had anything at all to say on the subject of lying, and then you compare all the various opinions written on the subject, and you look for whatever essential truths you could find that they all seem to agree on, and that was the answer to your initial question. Scholasticism also had total faith in the Greek philosopher and physicist Aristotle, who turned out to be wrong about many things, which we will see in the scientific revolution. All of the courses in scholasticism were taught in Latin. Students had to write and speak Latin, and that in itself was no big deal. Latin was the international language of the day. None of these aspects of scholasticism, though, prepared you for civic leadership of a republic. Then along came a guy named Francesco Petrarch, who lived from 1304 to 1374, better known to us as Petrarch, the father of what is called humanism. Humanism is an educational term. Another word for humanism is, you may have heard of these, liberal arts, or the humanities. You may have heard that term. Humanism would turn out to be the engine that drove the accomplishments of the Renaissance. So who was this Francesco Petrarch, otherwise known as Petrarch? Petrarch was a guy without a homeland. His dad had been an exiled Florentine, and a Florentine is a person from the city of Florence. His dad had found work in Avignon in France working for the Catholic Church. So Petrarch grew up in France and was educated first in France and then later in Italy. Ironically, though he had an enormous impact on the city of Florence, Petrarch refused to live in Florence, even though they invited him to live there. Petrarch traveled around monasteries and libraries, etc. That was his thing. That's what he loved to do. And he constantly pored over the ancient Roman manuscripts that he found in all of these places. Petrarch had gone to the university and had a scholastic education studying Roman law. And he had two problems with this system that we just described called scholasticism. Number one, it was too narrow to prepare you for life. His question about all this was, how is all this going to teach me to lead a productive life? How is this going to help me run, let's say, a government or a business or improve my community? From Petrarch's studies of Roman law, he felt that the Latin of his own time, that people were currently speaking and writing, was really, really bad. The grammar was bad, the syntax was bad, and it was unclear, and it was sloppy, and the style was uninspiring and irrelevant. Whenever Petrarch read the Latin of those great statesmen of the old Roman Republic, like Cicero, it was different. Completely different experience. Their Latin was eloquent, and it was beautiful, and it was clear and precise, and it was useful to Petrarch's own life, and it was motivating, and it made you go, yeah, let's get up and let's do this. Petrarch thought, if we could just get to know these guys again, they could teach us everything we need to know. The problem was that nobody in the Middle Ages was going to listen to a pagan, a non-Christian like Cicero. These ancient Romans didn't even believe in Jesus. They believed in all those gross, nasty, false pagan gods. And how could you seriously follow somebody like that? Petrarch's answer? Secularism. Petrarch was a Christian, but he said, Christ is my God, but Cicero is the prince of language. Petrarch argued that the secular world, and when we say the secular world, we mean the world apart from things like God and faith and heaven and the church. That secular world, it has its own kind of good too. And secularism says that things outside the church can be worthwhile and valuable and useful. If you want answers to your questions about God and heaven and salvation, then you're right. The ancient Romans of the Roman Republic, they can't help you. But if you want answers to questions about the here and now, things like, how do I make life better for the people in my city? Then Cicero is your man. So let's look at some examples. Here are some examples of the kinds of things that Petrarch was reading from Cicero. Necessities of good government. A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he's known and carries his banner openly. But the traitor moves among those within the gate freely. his sly whispers rustling through all the alleys, heard in the very halls of government itself. Sounds like he was in the United States in 2020, 2021. Cicero telling us how to run a republic. The budget should be balanced. The treasury should be refilled. Public debt should be reduced. The arrogance of officialdom should be tempered and controlled, and the assistance to foreign lands should be curtailed lest Rome become bankrupt. People must again learn to work instead of living on public assistance. The more laws, the less justice. That's an interesting quote. Here in the United States, in our current time, we have thousands and thousands of laws, and yet we also have a lot of injustice. Perhaps if Cicero were here today, he would say to us, of course you have lots of injustice. You have too many laws. Cicero praising humanity. Nothing is more noble, nothing more venerable than fidelity. Faithfulness and truth are the most sacred excellences and endowments of the human mind. Even Cicero's own life was itself a lesson in human potential. He lived from 106 BCE to 43 BCE during the days of the Roman Republic, and Cicero himself was born in one class and worked his way up into another higher class. Cicero was educated as a lawyer and practiced law. He was educated at Plato's Academy. That was a famous school named after Plato. He wrote philosophy. He held public office. He was married and had children. So back to this word humanism, which we said was an educational term, and we said that Petrarch was the father of. What is humanism? Well, humanism is the idea that human qualities, human characteristics, human values, human virtues, human achievement, human history, human potential, human expression, human emotion, human fulfillment, human happiness, and human individuality are all worth studying. Before humanism came along, the only things that the medieval scholastic mind considered worth contemplating were God, medicine, and the law. But when you went back to the classics, and when we say the classics, we mean the writings and the creations of the ancient Romans and Greeks. When you went back there, you discovered that those guys were all about people. Our virtues, our achievements, our values, our potential impact on the world. Everything that humanism touches is going to be touched with these three things. Number one, eloquence and precision of expression. What good is knowledge if you can't communicate effectively? Number two, secularism. We're going to contemplate things that are outside of the church as well as inside of the church. And number three, the classics, learning from the ancients of the Roman Republic and ancient Greece. Humanists recommended a course of study in the classics that would provide essential skills for future politicians, diplomats, government officials, lawyers, that is to say, better lawyers, military leaders, and businessmen, and writers and artists. Humanism would provide a much broader and more practical type of education than Scholasticism did. Meanwhile, those civic leaders that we mentioned back in this new Republic of Florence, they were finding out that Christianity and Scholasticism simply were not providing them with the ideas that they needed to run a republic. But Petrarch's secular, humanist ideas, they were starting to catch on. And those ideas were starting to get results. Here's a guy who explained humanism about as well as anyone, and his name was Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, or we can just call him Pico for short. And he lived from 1463 to 1494, so he died very young. He was a humanist, and he was a scholar and a philosopher, and he wrote an essay called Oration on the Dignity of Man. You will probably read it someday. And this work became known as the Manifesto of the Renaissance. In this essay, Pico made this powerful point. Man is unique among the creatures of the earth. Man is the only creature who can become whatever he or she wants to be. We can lift ourselves up to be just beneath angels, or we can lower ourselves down to the level of beasts. Here's what Pico meant. Now, he didn't write about giraffes, but I'm going to talk about giraffes. You see this giraffe? A giraffe is all this guy will ever be. No more, no less. He has no choice but to be a giraffe. He can't even contemplate how to be a better giraffe. But we humans can become anything we choose to. We can choose to become incredibly amazing, or we can choose to degrade ourselves to the level of beasts. That's humanism. That's the Renaissance. What is all of this going to lead to?